Hey, thanks for joining me again. I have a subject I want to talk about, and it's one of those third rail subjects that I should probably avoid like the plague. But heard some stuff today, saw some stuff today, and it's just got to get talked about. And that's white privilege. And the thing I saw was it was actually a clip from Jordan Peterson that somebody's been passing around on TikTok. And it's from a speech that he gave back in probably 2016. It was when he first started coming into prominence. And he's in this small auditorium somewhere in Canada. And he's talking about white privilege and how he views the concept of white privilege as being absolutely reprehensible. In fact, I think he uses the words reprehensible. And I don't think this was his intent, because at the time I was still kind of in that mindset. And when I heard him say it, I thought, yeah, it's a reprehensible concept. But, we've come to learn a lot of different things. And we also got to know Dr. Peterson quite a lot over the following years. And one thing that I learned is that the man just doesn't have a hateful bone in his body. I don't think he does. And he's just full of love and compassion, and he wants to do the right thing. And he applies cold logic to everything. But that phrase, saying that the concept of white privilege is reprehensible, that's quite divisive. So what I'm going to attempt is to talk about a little bit about each side of that, what he meant, what he's afraid of, because that's the kind of thing that people can take that out of context and run with it and say, hey, Jordan Peterson says that white privilege is reprehensible, so everybody can get bent. So forget all the Black Lives Matter folks. And then at the same time, the Black Lives Matter folks can say, look at Jordan Peterson. He says that white privilege is a reprehensible concept. So who's going to listen to him? And the fact is that a lot of things that he talks about, a lot of things that he teaches, are the exact things that the Black Lives Matter movement could really use right now. And people on the left in general. So maybe I can try and bridge that gap. So maybe try to unpack that a little bit. So it's important to understand Dr. Peterson's perspective. So he came of age in the 70s and 80s during the Cold War. And in fact, because he's about a decade or so older than me, and I remember the Cold War. I remember Gorbachev on TV, and I remember Ronald Reagan on TV, and I remember Jimmy Carter on TV. But it's still kind of vague memories, and I was still trying to figure out what the world of politics was. But I knew that it was scary, and I knew that my dad was upset. I knew that my folks were upset about it, my grandparents. And Jordan was, entering in college in those days. So it was kind of forming his view of the world. He talks about this a lot, that the things that happened during the Cold War really shocked him and humbled him. Because of the sheer destructive power that we as humans had developed. And he is a psychology student, a student of Carl Jung, who was exploring the shadow side and the dark side of humanity. In fact, he talks about this a lot, is that he was very aware of the fact that the only thing that separated him from a guard at a prison camp in Auschwitz, right, or a guard in the gulags, was a generation of birth and a little bit of geography, because when you're in an environment like that, it's very easy to become, it's very easy to succumb to the ideas that are flying around you. I've talked about this in other videos, and Carl Jung talks about this, and Jordan Peterson talks about this, and a lot of psychologists and philosophers talk about this, is the concept that people don't have ideas as much as ideas have people. And that's where things get dangerous. So if you look at Nazi Germany, for example, a lot of the people that did these terrible things to Jewish prisoners and to gays and to people with mental disabilities and to, gypsies and to, all these other groups, started out as decent folks. In fact, there's that one story, and I think this was actually a Soviet story, where there was a group of police officers, I think they might have been Germans, I forget right now, but where they started out and they were just like regular guys. But they got conscripted into the military, and they were just convinced that this is the right thing to do. And they slowly, over time, went from being regular guys who were just hanging out at the pub, having a couple of beers, and they loved their wives and their kids, and all this sort of thing, and they would, wouldn't hurt a fly, to being men who would readily execute pregnant women and shoot them in the back of the head. Because it was that slow degradation, I mean, you can see it now. You can see it in the news today with Trump followers. Because there are people out there right now who 5-6 years ago, they were, good, decent, loving people who were full of compassion and made sense and, made logical decisions, and they could look at things rationally. Now, they have the reverse of Trump derangement syndrome, By that I mean, there are some people who are like, Orange Man bad, and just run away screaming from everything that he does. And then the other end of Trump derangement syndrome is Orange Man good, and embrace him no matter what he does. And the thing is, both of those are on a spectrum of the same ideology, right? And that's what I mean by the concept that people don't have ideas as much as ideas have people. So how does that fit into white privilege? It's kind of the same thing. It's kind of that spectrum, I mean, you can't deny that white privilege exists. If you are in a position where you think that white privilege does not exist, then I would say you're over on the far right of the spectrum. And if you're in a position where you say that white privilege absolutely exists and has to be completely eradicated, then you're on the far left of the spectrum. That's right, my camera's reversed, so I don't know which way it's showing you guys. But that's the ideology. That's the part that Dr. Peterson is upset with, is the fact that it's an ideology. And that's why he says it's reprehensible. It's not so much, in fact, if you look at his material, he'll say that, of course, there's white privilege, But what he's speaking about is the privilege of the majority. Now, if you've watched my videos, that's one of those nuanced points where I disagree with him. Because he says the privilege of the majority. And normally in culture, we think of it in those terms. And I think Dr. Peterson would agree with me on this particular nuance, is that it's not fair to say majority privilege because of situations like South Africa, or when the whites came into Africa and started harvesting slaves, or when the Spanish went into South America and started to subdue the natives there, or when the whites came into North America and, eradicated so many of the indigenous people, or Australia. And pick a case. I mean, this has happened time and again throughout history. Attila the Hun, look what he did. He was a minority, right? But he went and he set up, kingdoms all over the place. And that was how empires spread, is a minority of people would come in to a place and they would set up their government and through military force. And then they would just say, okay, we've got the guns, we've got the swords, therefore we make the laws. If you don't like it, off with your head, I guess. And then they would set up the laws so that they benefited them. So that's why I balk against the concept of majority rule, or when I balk against people who say that it's white privilege, or that it's like white colonialism, because in recent memory, the last couple hundred years, it's a few hundred years, handful of 100 years, yeah, it's been our turn. The Caucasians have been doing a lot of it, spreading out of Europe, spreading across the globe to South America and Asia, and to wherever, Africa, and all across the continent of North America. But where it becomes a problem, though, is, okay, so but in all those cases, and even right now today, Caucasians aren't a majority in the world. They did a study with National Geographic a few years ago, and the average human being is actually a Chinese man from like somewhere in the back country of China. If you take all the averages and all the populations and you say like what is the average human being on Earth, it's a Chinese guy living in some farm in the back country in China. We are not the majority on the planet, not even close to it. We're the majority in the West, and that's shrinking. But what we do have, and this is a lot what the protests are about, this is what's going on right now, is we have the government, we have the authority, just like they did in South Africa. The whites were a tiny minority, but they had the government. And when you have the power of the government behind you, then that's when the privilege shows up. That's when you start benefiting from it, right? So getting back to the concept of white privilege then, in our nation, there is white privilege. And it's something that we need to, especially as Caucasians, be aware of. And I want to say take advantage of, but that has the wrong connotation. It's almost more like we need to leverage to help those who don't have it, right? And what that means, though, is that here's the other thing, and this is the debate I've had with some of these guys on TikTok, is that racism occurs when, that's when racism occurs, is when a specific ethnic group comes into governmental power, whether on a large scale or a smaller scale, and makes decisions, creates guidance, creates privilege, creates, guidelines and rules, and, oppresses another ethnic group. That's what racism is. And so you can see from that definition, then it can happen on, it doesn't have to be white people and black people, it happens in China right now. The Chinese people are like fantastically racist against Africans, and Japanese are fantastically racist against anybody who's not Japanese, on the island, within Japan. They're kind people, they're lovely people. But if you go and live there and you're a white dude or a black dude, yikes, it's awkward. So what does that mean then? So how do you kind of unpack all that? So here's what I think Dr. Peterson is getting at, okay? And one of the things that he's afraid of is that in Ukraine and during the time of the Soviet Union, when they formed the gulags, and during the time of Nazi Germany, when they were dragging Jews out into the streets, and slaughtering people, and both groups slaughtered hundreds of millions of people. The Germans slaughtered dozens of millions, but the Soviets, the communists, they slaughtered hundreds of millions of people. And it was all because of ideology. It was like, so like in the Ukraine, there was the slaughters that went on because, there were some people who were farmers, and they had small farms, and they had a little bit more than everybody else, which didn't fit the communist model of things. And some folks decided that, they were therefore bad and needed to be eradicated. So they did. So, they dragged them out in the street and brutally murdered thousands of people. But it's because that idea had them. These aren't the type of people who are going to join a mob and go drag random strangers out into the street and murder them brutally. That's not somebody who's like thinking with their higher cognitive functions. That's somebody who's reacting. That's somebody who has been manipulated, who has been worked up into a frenzy and is acting the way that the crowd is acting. And the idea has gotten into the crowd, and now the crowd is moving. And now the people who are part of that crowd are, rolling through. And it's the same thing we're seeing right now in the United States with the riots and the protests that are going on all over the country. In fact, I saw a video the other day where there was one guy, it's a white guy, I think it was in Montana, and there was a bunch of folks, and they had him surrounded. They were all around him, and they were chanting peaceful, peaceful, but they were screaming it. There was like shrill screams of peaceful, peaceful. And there's this one guy in the middle of this group, and he's freaking out, and he's mad. He's trying to be a tough guy. He's knocking signs out of their hands, getting in people's faces and yelling at them and stuff like that. But it's because nobody in that group was, well, that's not true. I don't say nobody, because there were a couple people who tried to come up and talk to him, but they didn't really understand the group dynamics, The smarter thing would have been to say, sir, just here, make eye contact with me here. This is a bad situation for you. Would you like to come with me and talk somewhere? Or try to get him to de-escalate. Or maybe go around the rest of the crowd and say, folks, hey, shh, settle down now, let's give this man some space. And maybe even get in and defend him, get between him and other people and say, no, we're not gonna do this. We're not gonna do this. We're gonna de-escalate, everybody else de-escalate, but nobody's trying to do that. And when you're in a crowd like that, then that's the energy that's going on. So it's hard to not just say, peaceful, peaceful, and want to bash the guy in the face while you're screaming the word peaceful. It doesn't make much sense. Which brings me back to why Dr. Peterson says that the concept of white privilege is reprehensible. Because he views it as an ideology. It's something that doesn't exist. It's not that we can't leverage it to benefit people. It's not that some people don't take advantage of it and live privileged lives. And it's not that some people don't observe it being lived out by other folks and resent it. Yeah, so all of those things are true. But where it becomes a problem, and what Dr. Peterson sees, because he studied Jung so much, and he understands the dark side of humanity so much, is that that's the sort of thing that can grow out of control so rapidly. And that's what he fears. I have a different hypothesis about it. Because I think that people of color possibly, well, I was going to say are less likely to act on something like that, but then you got cases like Rwanda and you've got this other kind of stuff, so I really think it is just a human thing, you know. And I think that might just be part of my white guilt or whatever it is that you want to call it, where, you know, I want to give other people the benefit of the doubt and say, well, people with brown skin are better than I am, but, you know, we're all just humans. And nobody's any better or any worse. And crazy shit happens all around the world all the time. So here's what I want you to do with that, though. With this whole concept of white privilege. Especially if you're like a white dude or a white lady. If you're a white person. And you hear this kind of talk, you know, and or if you feel that, or if you are not a supporter of Black Lives Matter, and you hear people talking about Black Lives Matter and white privilege and all this kind of stuff, and it makes you kind of, you get that anxiety, you know, like some people are saying, oh, you're better than me, blah, 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 but, you know, you grew up in the sticks. I mean, I grew up in the sticks. We literally lived in a cellar hole for, you know, a year or so. We didn't have a house. We were homeless. So it didn't seem like there was any privilege there, you know. But you have to remember that the privilege that they're talking about is that I can just go and talk to a cop. I can just run down my street, you know. Nobody gives me a ration of shit, you know. I've also got veteran privilege, you know. I got that. I can get away with anything. You know, I can speed, I can drive a car without a registration, I can drive, you know, whatever. And if I get pulled over, I'll be like, oh, sorry. Here's my retired military ID. Oh, and by the way, this face. You know, if you're black, you know, if you got up in the morning, you're going somewhere and you still got your do-rag on. I don't know. But make sure you get your paperwork straight. And that's the thing, though, you know, and that's where it becomes reprehensible, is that people don't have that kind of rational conversation about it. They don't look at it and say, oh, this is a thing that we can use, you know. People deny it, and then people get pissed about it because somebody else is denying it, and they get more pissed, and they deny it more, and then blah, 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 blah. Next thing you know, you're going to have a mob of people dragging white people out in the street and chopping their heads off. It's happened in the past. And that's why it's reprehensible. And that is also why it's critical, not the idea of white privilege being reprehensible, but the fact that it is an ideology that can escalate to mass violence. Any ideology that can escalate to mass violence must be addressed soundly and fairly and correctly from a place of rationality and love, you know, through full and open conversations between people who have the ability to get their ego out of the way. And that's why that's reprehensible, you know. It's not reprehensible because it doesn't exist. It's not, you know, nobody's denying that it doesn't exist. What he's saying, what I'm saying, is that we have to use this, you know. It's the same thing that, like, where I talk about, you know, our evolutionary tendencies, you know, where we have to learn about our evolutionary tendencies and then learn how to apply them and leverage them in positive ways. You know, like rape culture is a real thing, but you're not going to get people to stop having sex, right? So what you have to do is understand why rape culture happens on an evolutionary basis, you know, what that sex drive is in men and where that happens within women, and say, okay, well, we have these two, like, weird, shitty things that served us really well when we were monkeys, but, you know, not so much anymore. So what are we going to do with them? Because we have them. You can't not have those. you know, it's going to be hundreds and hundreds of years before those impulses don't exist anymore. They have to be bred out over long, long periods of time. But in the meantime, the way that you start doing that is coming at it smartly and saying, oh, I've got 2 piles of shit here. How do I reintegrate them and turn them back into soil so that something beautiful can grow out of it? And it's the same concept with what we call white privilege, but it is more accurate to say governmental ethnic homogeny privilege. Governmental ethnic homogeny. So you got GEH. You got GEH privilege. It's not as cool as white privilege, but that's basically what it is. Anyway, those are my thoughts. This went a little bit long. I love you. Hope this helped. Hope this clarified some stuff. Like, subscribe, follow? Maybe. I don't know. And pass this idea around, you know, have rational conversations where you can get ego out of the way and have rational conversations. And as soon as the ego comes up, just say, you know what, my ego is getting in the way. I'm going to step back for a little bit. And that's fine. That's the way that you're supposed to do that. When you feel the ego wanting to fight, when you feel it wanting to bite out, when you feel it wanting to say, you know, defending yourself, that's when you say, well, because remembering, be remembering in that situation what the ego does. The ego's function is for when you are an infant and you have to be the center of attention, because the only thing that you can do to survive is to scream and make sure everybody's looking at you and make sure that you're right. You know, like, I'm hungry, I need food, and I can't do this on my own, so somebody needs to feed me. So the ego is there to help you to be able to survive. But, you know, if you're developing properly and you have good parenting, then by the time you're like 13 years old or so, you should have that under control. And you should know, okay, well, I need enough ego to be able to, like, feed myself when I'm hungry, and to, you know, make sure I have food and shelter, and that, you know, the people that I'm responsible for are cared for. But have it under control enough that you're not just, like, making yourself the center of everything all the time and always feeling defensive and always lashing out. Anyway, those are my thoughts on the matter. Hopefully, Dr. Peterson would agree with me. I think he does. I think he would. I hope he's doing well, deeply. So, always counting on that 6 degrees of separation. If anybody can get a message back to him, send him my best regards. And we all love him and miss him very much. And I hope this was helpful to you. So, love you very much. Thank you for listening. And we can do this. We can do this. I love you. Bye-bye.